Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC, Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. I am your host, Josh Hadley, and there's a lot going on in the science fiction world right now. I mean, there always is, but I've been seeing something that's really been bothering me of lately. Well, of lately being the last 10 or 15 years. Now, Mystery Science Theater is not the problem with this. I'll address Mystery Science Theater in a completely different episode. But there's this thing where everybody loves this so bad it's good. I can't stand that concept. Oh, Tommy Wiseau's The Room. Oh, it's so bad that it's good. Or you see like a Sharknado or some of the crap that's coming out on the Sci-Fi channel and all that. And it's like, oh, this is so bad. It is so much fun. Oh my God, can I not stand this crap? A bad film should not be rewarded by being a bad film. Now, that's not to say you can't get enjoyment out of a bad film. For instance, like Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space. Nobody's going to deny Plan 9 from Outer Space, Bride of the Monster, or anything like that, or even something not Ed Wood related from that classic era like Robot Monster or anything like that. They are very enjoyable films, but you also objectively could say these are bad films too. I mean, there's no way we can say these aren't bad films. But there's a difference between Robot Monster or Plan 9 from Outer Space and whatever's being crapped out onto Amazon Prime this month that someone shot on a camcorder that they bought at Walmart for $40 in their backyard. And that's the thing. When you should not be looked down upon or pilloried for liking what you like. If you genuinely like The Room or Sharknado or something like that, there's no problem with that. That should never be an issue. You should not ever let someone talk down to you. You should never let somebody go, oh, you like that movie? You should just figuratively, not literally, punch those people in the face and move on. Again, figuratively, not physically. And the thing about that is, when you make a movie, you should always, or the filmmaker, the producer, whoever, should always be striving to make their best. They should be striving to make the best whatever kind of movie that it is that they can possibly make. Now, sometimes it's a dicey road, because what if it's like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, where you're not trying to make a bad movie, because nobody wants a bad movie. You can't enjoy a bad movie. But something like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, it was emulating a style of these movies from the 1950s and 1960s that were bad. But you got to remember, those original movies were not trying to be bad. Nobody went to The Beginning of the End or The Giant Mantis or anything like that and were like, you know what? Let's spend all this money and make a bad movie. Okay, something like The Giant Claw. Yeah, it turned out really doofy looking and really bad, and we can't deny that. But at the same time, you look at the cast, you look at the production, they were giving it their all. They weren't trying to make a bad movie. They ended up making a bad movie. And there's a huge difference there. When you look at Plan 9 from Outer Space, you see so much passion, so much effort put forth. Yeah, it didn't work, like at all, but you see so much passion that almost bleeds through the film onto the screen. And that's one of the beautiful things about something like even Robot Monster. There was a lot of bad decisions made, but they were trying to make a movie, a good movie. Then you look at something like Sharknado. They weren't trying to make a bad movie. They were saying to themselves, let's make a bad movie. Or they weren't trying to make a good movie. They were trying to make a bad movie, I mean. They said to themselves, let's make a bad movie. People really like these Sci-Fi Channel originals, like Ice Spiders and stuff like that. Lavalantula, I think, had come out before that. And those movies, Lavalantula, Ice Spiders, and that, were made earnestly. They were made by people trying to make the best movie they could on whatever limited resources and shooting time they had. That should not be looked down on. Whereas the people that made Sharknado, and pretty much anything that the Asylum craps out, all they ever do is go, let's make this bad. Because that's what people like. They completely misinterpreted how people responded to Ice Spiders or Lavalantula. And they're like, whoa, these movies are really bad and people really like these. Maybe that's the market we should hit. And that's where the problem comes in. I despise, this movie is so bad it's good. Because bad filmmaking should never be rewarded with accolades. Ever. Never, never, never. And that's the problem we're getting into here. These movies are being awarded accolades for being bad. And like I said, Mystery Science Theater is somewhat to blame for this, but you have a whole generation now, especially with the internet and all of these pseudo-critics that know nothing that are on YouTube. You get all of these people that now they go into a movie not saying, I would really like to see how good this is. They go into a movie nowadays and they go, let's see how bad it is. Now, that can absolutely sometimes be an enjoyable thing where you're like, okay, I hated the trailer, I hate most of the cast, I hate the director, I'm going to see it just to see it. Because I've actually done that myself where I'm like, okay, this movie, there's no way it's going to be any good. Like Transformers Dark of the Moon or whatever it was. After reading about all of the production problems and how bad the first one was and all that, it was like, okay, there's no way this movie is going to be any good. So part of me was saying, let's see just how bad it is. But part of me was also saying, what if this actually surprises me and is really, really good? It wasn't, but go back and look at Transformers Dark of the Moon. No one from Michael Bay on down was trying to make a bad movie. They made one of the worst movies of the 2000s, but they were not trying to make a bad movie. They were trying to make the best movie they could. They ran into problems, some of which were of their own creation, some of which were not. But that is where the line should be drawn. I guess in a way, intention should be taken into account here. Because the intention is what really, truly matters here. Because, like I said, when you're trying to make a bad movie, then you can only make a bad movie. And like I said, we've all done this before, where we've gone, let's see how bad this is. But a lot of times, I'm usually disappointed, but I'll try to go into a movie and say, all right, to take a line from Night of the Creeps, thrill me. Doesn't usually work, but every now and then, I'll walk out going, that was not only better than I thought it was going to be, that was absolutely freaking fantastic. And when you go in going, let's see how bad it is, or, ooh, this is going to be so bad, it's going to be fun. Not only are you robbing the movie of its dignity, but you are robbing yourself of the actual appreciation of watching a film. Because see, I believe that when you watch a movie, it should be to ingest into your brain whatever that movie is trying to tell. Whether it's a complex story, whether it's a simple story, whether it's a love story, a sci-fi story, aliens, horror, sex, porno, whatever. It should be, I want to see what's going to happen. I want to see what happens to these characters, to this story. I want to see what happens in the third act, etc., etc., etc. So when you don't do that, when you're like, I just want to see how bad this is, or when you watch a movie passively, oh, I'm bored, let's just put something on in the background. Not only is that you being indignant to the film, that's you being indignant to yourself. A film should be watched. A film should be analyzed. Now, you look at something like Grown Ups. There's not a deep analytical note to any of that. I understand that. But to just, this new generation just throws something on in the background. Oh, I'll put Netflix on and keep autoplay going. Oh, it's just something to have in the background when I'm cleaning. No. You're to sit down and watch a movie. Put your damn phone down. Stop playing Farmville, or I probably don't even have Farmville anymore, but whatever stupid game is out there, and just sit and watch a movie. You don't know how many times I'll have somebody, I'll give somebody a recommendation, like Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You, which I thought was the best film of 2018. And people will be like, oh, it was too weird. I couldn't get into it. Well, what did you think about this theme and this and this? And, oh, well, I got bored and I started playing a game on my phone. Well, you didn't watch the goddamn movie then, did you? You don't have the right to tell me you don't get it at that point. You can't tell me it's a bad movie because you didn't watch the damn movie. And that's the crap I'm getting sick of. If you don't watch the movie, I don't want to hear you bitch about the quality of the movie. And you need to stop going into a movie saying, how bad is this going to be? And I know sometimes that's a little bit difficult because sometimes when you watch the trailer, you just say to yourself, oh, wow, there's no way this is going to be good. And 9 times out of 10, you're absolutely correct. Because, whenever Dollar Tree gets out new DVDs, I always go and pick through all of them. I'll buy $20 or $30 worth of DVDs. Titles I've never heard of. I don't know these movies. I've never heard of them before, never seen a trailer. And every now and then you find an actual gem and it's like, whoa, that was actually really, really good. Most of the time, you wasted $1. But at least you went in with an open mind. So stop this so bad it's good crap. I'm sick of hearing, I love this movie, it's so bad it's good. I can't stand this, and you need to stop doing that. You need to appreciate a film for what it is. Maybe it's a super low budget movie, and it's telling a story that's within its limited budget. Should that be judged on the same level as a Spielberg film? No, it absolutely should not. You need to judge each film based on what it is, not what you wanted from it. And especially if you want it to be bad, it's going to be bad. I can't tell you how many classic films, horror films, sci-fi films, action films were completely destroyed by their original critics. When they first came out critically, that this is bad. And now these are the benchmarks everything in film is measured against. So stop telling me, oh, we need to keep watching these Sci-Fi Channel originals. They're so bad. Oh, the whatever the Asylum is diarrheaing out this month. Yes, I absolutely despise the Asylum. I don't think those people have put out a good thing since about 2000. The last good movie they put out was 1999's Anarchy TV, and that was only a pickup, so they didn't even make that. The Asylum are also partially responsible for the so bad it's good nonsense. But I'm saying to you, the listeners, if any one of you is listening to this and puts any stock in what I say, and I know I'm hardly a pragmatist, I know I'm hardly a friendly voice in this, stop so bad it's good. Just stop it. Stop using that term. Stop using that mindset when you watch a movie. Instead, watch a movie for what it is. Don't say, hey, I want to watch the new whatever piece of crap the Asylum is putting out, Instead, go and look at a good company. Look at something like A24 or something like that. Something that Neon Pictures is putting out. And I'm just talking new stuff here and say, I want to actually try and find a good movie. Maybe you won't. Maybe it won't be a good movie. You might not like anything that's coming out there. But look at something like Six String Samurai. There are people who would absolutely, if I described the plot of Six String Samurai to you, you'd immediately say to yourself, oh, this is going to be a fantastic bad movie. No, it's not. And stop talking to yourself like that. It's a fantastic movie. It's not a fantastic bad movie. So, for your own edification and mine, stop so bad it's good. Okay? Wakaliwood movies are like the modern Ed Wood films, and I mean that in a positive way. If you look at something that Wakaliwood puts out, you like Who Killed Captain Alex, there's no way you'll say to yourself, wow, that was so bad it's good. You'll say, that was pretty bad, but my God, were they trying, and they were trying hard, and that really shines through. So, we're going to take a break, and then after that, I'll be talking to you a little bit about one of my favorite sci-fi genres. I'll be talking to you about an author you may or may not know, and we'll look at some anthology TV shows just because, well, I like anthology TV shows of the past.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
I absolutely love Cyberpunk. I don't know how you guys feel about Cyberpunk. I'm talking as a genre. Cyberpunk is one of my favorite genres of everything, whether it be comic books, whether it be novels, whether it be video games, sci-fi movies, whatever. I love Cyberpunk so much. And the thing with Cyberpunk is it's really, really been ramping up of late. In just pop culture, because we got Cyberpunk 2077. It was supposed to have come out, I think last month or something like that, but then it got pushed to, I think it's November now. So everybody's talking about Cyberpunk. I love the Cyberpunk genre. I grew up in this genre. I read Neuromancer way earlier than I probably was able to understand it. I'll say that bluntly. Because when Neuromancer came out in 1984, I would have been 9 years old. And I know I read it at some point before I got to middle school. So I know Neuromancer was way beyond where my mental capabilities were to digest such a complex book like that. But when you think of Cyberpunk, what do you think of? Do you think of this a William Gibson sort of landscape? Do you think of The Matrix? Do you think of Blade Runner? Do you think of Shadowrun? Do you think of the FASA Cyberpunk game or the Steve Jackson Cyberpunk game or anything like that? What do you think of when you think of Cyberpunk? Whether it be, I guess this is the question. What do you think of when you think of Cyberpunk then? Like when you were a child, when you were a teenager, assuming you are still not a teenager, versus what do you think of Cyberpunk now? because I have just been seeing, not just on YouTube, but all over the internet, Cyberpunk, 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 anything from the past of Cyberpunk, anybody that wants to get in on all of what's happening with Cyberpunk 2077 and the updates and all this stuff, they have just been going nonstop on anything that could conceivably be called Cyberpunk. And some of this stuff is pretty stretching it. There are some things being included that are absolutely not Cyberpunk, nor were they ever Cyberpunk. But because they have an element of Cyberpunk in it. And I can't even count how many times I'm going to say Cyberpunk in this. But to me, Cyberpunk is always been described to me as high tech, low life. And that is what Cyberpunk really is. I mean, I've written Cyberpunk comic books. I've written a few Cyberpunk short stories. I've read the role-playing game stuff. I've read the Shadowrun. I've read so many different weirdo novels, seen so many movies. I would love to have a Cyberpunk movie fight with somebody out there, because I've probably seen more of these than are probably healthy, honestly. But then also, what is it about Cyberpunk that makes it interesting for you? I know for me, one of the things that I think is interesting is not just the high-tech, low-life thing, but there's always been the visual style, that very Max Headroom kind of televisions everywhere, the old CRT TVs, and it's sort of video, and then there's aspects of piracy, and then you've got the punk part of it. I've always been a punk rock fan. I used to have a huge mohawk that went all the way down to the middle of my back that I could spike up and all this, and there's just this blending of the technology with the sort of anarchistic screw you attitude that Cyberpunk always has. Because who's generally the villain in a Cyberpunk story? A corporation, something that is conglomerated. Whereas they say they want the freedom of the individuality of, I'm a punk, man. I don't conform to nobody, except we all know punk has become a uniform and a uniformity, so there's a strange aspect in that. But Cyberpunk, to me, has always been a very rebellious genre. It's always been a very, very counterculture, very sticking it to the man, very rebel against an overwhelming force. And sometimes the movies reflect this, sometimes they don't. Now, obviously, Cyberpunk 2077 isn't out yet, so all I have to go on for the new game is the gameplay footage that's been released to YouTube and some of the reviews of the people who've played the first couple of hours or things, some of the games journalists. And I don't necessarily trust them. These are the same people who said Last of Us 2 is a genius work, and, well, you're a mental misfit. You're a mental midget if you think Last of Us 2 is anything but utter garbage. But anyway, when it comes to Cyberpunk the game, I have not been this excited about a video game in ages. I can almost not think of another time where I was anticipating a video game more. Strangely enough, I think the last time, and this is really going to go back a while, that the last time I was anticipating a video game this much was an arcade game. And that was Mortal Kombat 2. I had played so much Mortal Kombat, so much Street Fighter when I was in high school and just out of high school. I remember my wife and I would always go to the mall and they would have a Mortal Kombat machine, and I would spend way too much money playing Mortal Kombat. So when Mortal Kombat 2 was coming out, like I said, this isn't even for a home system. This isn't for a SNES or a Genesis or anything. When it was getting ready to come out in the arcade, and you could only play it at 50 cents a pop, I was so anticipating this. That was the last time I can remember anticipating a game as much as I am for Cyberpunk 2077. And I don't even have a system to play it on. I still have an Xbox 360 that's literally falling apart. It's missing its front, the drawer doesn't open, and this isn't being made for the 360. So at some point before September or November or whatever the release date is now, I'm going to have to pick up an Xbone. And I will literally do that to play Cyberpunk 2077. And I just can't think of another time when a video game has had that much hype. Maybe Halo 3? Maybe the release of Halo 3 was that big? Not for me personally, but out there. But then what do you think the fallout is going to be on the science fiction genre? Because as I said, right now everything that's even remotely connected to the cyberpunk genre is being dredged up now in anticipation of the search engine optimization that is Cyberpunk 2077. Like literally go to YouTube and just type in the word cyberpunk. That's it. No 2077, no video game. Just type in cyberpunk. And you're going to have to wade through hundreds of Cyberpunk 2077 results before you even get to something to do with William Gibson or Wild Palms or anything like that. So people want to capitalize on that. And I just want to know from the audience here, from listeners, what do you think of cyberpunk, the genre? What was the first thing that got you into it? Was it a novel? Did you run across the Shadowrun game at some point? Did you run across the Steve Jackson stuff? Did you run across it through GURPS? Did you run across it through a comic book? Did you run across it through Transmetropolitan? Did you run across Max Headroom, if you're old enough to remember in the 80s when not just the Max Headroom show was out, but when he was a spokesman for Coke? What about cyberpunk drew you in? Because if you're a science fiction fan, you can't dislike cyberpunk. I don't know a single science fiction fan who's ever had a problem and said, I really don't like that cyberpunk stuff. I mean, body augmentation and jacking into their brains. No, I can see a regular person, a civilian, saying that. But if you're a science fiction fan, you love cyberpunk. You kind of have to. It's kind of encoded into your science fiction DNA. So why is cyberpunk so influential? I think in the 80s when it was created, cyberpunk was very much that, like I said, that counterculture sort of thing. It was fighting because we had just had Reagan elected, and then in 1984 it was Morning in America and the moral majority, and you had the excess of the 80s, you had the growing dependence on computers and technology. So I truly can see how in the 1980s, cyberpunk really rooted itself. And I know the actual roots of cyberpunk technically go back earlier than that, but what we think of as cyberpunk really didn't start until Neuromancer came out in 1984. I mean, yeah, Blade Runner had some, Tron had some. Those were elements. What we think of as cyberpunk, we owe almost exclusively to William Gibson. But then when you get into the 90s and things were changing, you had Bill Clinton coming in, you had the politics of the country. I'm just speaking for America, obviously. You had the politics of the country sort of loosening up somewhat. And when that happened, cyberpunk kind of, it's funny. When you talk about cyberpunk on film, its most fertile period was in the 1990s. The time where arguably it was least influential as a pop culture phenomenon. And I find that sort of interesting. And then, because by the time you get to the 2000s, you have the actual internet taking over, so it's oddly relevant again, but you didn't have as many of these. So it's sort of strange when you think about it in that term, that the time where it was the least relevant was the time where it was the most popular. But maybe that's the cyclical cycle of this, that it was popular because it was no longer relevant. Does that make any sense? Because now cyberpunk still has a lot of impact. But with the internet, with people actually getting real body modifications, I'm not just talking the somebody who wants plastic surgery or a chip put in them. I'm talking about you get your arm cut off in an accident. They can kind of replace that now with an almost cyberpunk style style arm and with, these ultralight plastics and 3D printers and that. Is Cyberpunk more or less relevant today then? That's the other question. Because now Cyberpunk, we're kind of living in a cyberpunk world. I mean, especially with the chaos of the world and the technological levels and the internet. Are we not living in a cyberpunk world? And if we are, does that make the cyberpunk stories of the past more or less relevant to what we're doing now? And let's just take a moment to look at Neuromancer. So when Neuromancer came out, it was so far ahead of the game. It literally created a genre. It was its own thing. So if you read Neuromancer now, knowing what you know about the internet, knowing what you know about body modification and augmentation and government corporate control, political assassination, all this stuff that's rooted into the novel, that's just baked into the premise itself, what do you think of Neuromancer? Does it hold up better in 2020 than it did in 1984? Or do you think it really dated itself like say, The Dark Knight Returns, Batman The Dark Knight Returns, which I think is still a shockingly powerful Batman story, but it's kind of an 80s Batman story. So how does Neuromancer fit into that? Is it so 80s that it can't be relevant today, or is it timeless? And that also goes for Cyberpunk in general. Is it so timeless that the genre will continue to grow, or has it just become sort of a fashion thing at this point? So that's the question I want you to answer, is where does Cyberpunk tune into all this? So that said, we're going to take another break in a minute, and after we do that, I'm going to show you an author David Irons. And this is a guy you may not have heard of, and I want to change that because I want you to hear of him. I want you to buy some of his books because I think they're absolutely fantastic. So we'll talk about that after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So do you guys like horror novels? Because I do. I've always liked horror novels. I've always grown up with reading Richard Matheson, and I remember when Clive Barker first came to these shores, my God, did those books of blood just knock me on my ass. Those were like something you'd never seen anything like Clive Barker before that. And I'd always grown up reading anthology tales, or when someone like Harlan Ellison would do a pure horror story, it was always just absolutely fantastic and amazing. And there's a new author. He was a filmmaker before this. He got frustrated making films, short films, music videos, commercials, things like that. And so he decided he was going to just start writing horror stories. His name is David Irons, and I know that sounds like it's a made-up name, but it's not. That's actually his real name. I've interviewed him a few times, and his work is just fantastic. He's putting out very strange sci-fi kind of tinged horror novels that more people should be picking up. In the next 5 years, I'm hoping David Irons turns out to be the next Dean Koontz or something like that. Because he's putting out unique ideas with a very 80s throwback sheen. And that's very much intentional. Hell, his latest novel has stickers all over the cover that make it look like an ex-VHS rental from the 80s. And that's absolutely what he was going for. So David Irons, like I said, he made some short films and stuff, but then he put out his first book, which was Night Waves. It's kind of a super violent, sexual siren tale. Sirens from the sea coming out and taking over people's bodies. It's sort of a body snatcher thing, and they're rending people limb from limb, blah, blah, blah. It's really an interesting book. I got to read an early copy. I have a pull quote on the cover of this one. So am I biased? Probably not, because anyone that's ever met me knows I will tell you something is crap. If I think you made crap, I will tell you it's crap. And I didn't tell David that this was crap because I really liked it. And Night Waves is, like I said, it's like it's literally almost a siren tale. And by that I mean you've got the horror with the sea and beaches, and it very much feels like, and I mean this in the best possible way, it feels like, remember when Jaws came out? And Spielberg, stumbled into Jaws. I've often said that Jaws is probably the best accidental masterpiece ever made. And remember what happened in the wake of Jaws? That it took him a couple of years to make Jaws 2, which Spielberg wasn't involved in, but there were all of these knockoffs. There were the Italian knockoffs and the Spanish knockoffs, and everybody decided we're going to knock off Jaws. And that was not necessarily bad, because I personally love those kind of movies. But like Roger Corman eventually would make, Joe Dante would make for Roger Corman, Piranha. That is more what Night Waves is going for. It's not trying to be Peter Benchley's Jaws. It's trying to be Joe Dante and Roger Corman's Piranha to Jaws. So if you like that kind of thing, then you will absolutely like Night Waves. And then after that, he made Polybius. Now, Polybius is an original tale based on the old urban legend of Polybius. Polybius was said to be, that's this conspiracy theory, it was said to be this video game that was released in the early 80s, and they only made 1 or 2 cabinets of it. It was an arcade game. And it was, depending on what version of the conspiracy theory you're talking about, it was either a CIA mental health, mental control experiment, or it was just an accident that this happened. But supposedly, now remember, all of this needs a giant asterisk next to it. The original Polybius game would be, it would be a game that was just test marketed, and it became addictive. It became like a video game drug. You couldn't stop playing it, and it would cause mental damage. It would just suck all your quarters out of your pocket. You just could not stop playing it. This video game would literally, something in the code, something with the way it flashed, it would drive you crazy. That's the legend. Okay, obviously I don't believe it. I don't believe the CIA was trying to control people with a video game, or that this was a mental control test, or it was just some weird random pattern of things that, oh my God, look at this. People are going crazy when they play this game. And then it was, nobody could ever find a copy of the game. There's lots of people who've claimed, I found it, but no, you haven't. But that's the legend. So David Irons' book is a play on that legend, and it's set in the 80s, and it's full of sleaze. And let's just say Publishers Weekly did not like the book at all, and David Irons wears that as a badge of honor. That Publishers Weekly really, really did not like this book because of how sleazy it is, and they didn't quite understand the 80s-ness of it. And it's not only his best-selling book right now, but it's actually out of print. The second printing is coming out couple of weeks after you hear this probably. So there's Polybius you can look for. Then he made one about little spider creatures in a cemetery called Night Creepers. I actually really like the tagline for this one. You are what they eat. I really like that tagline. But this one is more of a traditional creature feature sort of thing, but in book form, obviously. It's just more kind of cardboard cutout characters fighting little monsters in a cemetery and trying not to get eated. That's pretty much Night Creepers, and I think it's pretty fantastic, actually. I don't think it's his best. We'll get to that. It's a good book. And then he decided he was going to try his hand at some sort of children's book. And by children, I mean older children. He was probably going more for 12 to 13-year-olds with his next book, Graveyard Billy. I don't think it would qualify as a YA book, but it's definitely not for little children. But this one is about a cat and a ghost trying to catch a supernatural serial killer. And this one, he literally wrote this to help animals. All of the proceeds from Graveyard Billy go to animal shelters. He's a British author in the UK. And so whether you like Graveyard Billy or not, you're not really wasting your money on this one, because even if you buy Graveyard Billy and you don't like it, you're still going to be helping a good cause. So you can go to Graveyard Billy there. But then his newest one, which I think is his best one, is called Wolf Moon. It is absolute 80s trash sleaze, and it's embracing every moment of that. It's about werewolves on a spaceship in the future. And it's exactly what you think it is. It's a lycanthropy disease, and people are fighting werewolves on a spaceship. The tagline for this one is, in space, it's always a full moon. So I think Wolf Moon is his best because I'm more, as much as I love horror, I've worked for Fangoria, Rue Morgue, Horror Hound, stuff like that. My personal tendencies have always moved more towards science fiction. I don't know why that is, but it's always been like that. I've always been more of a sci-fi guy than a horror guy, as much as I do love horror. And then fantasy would be right after horror. But the thing about that is, I just love the blending of the ridiculousness of werewolves in space. And I don't mean space werewolves, because you've kind of seen that in other films. Oh, it's a werewolf-type creature that's from outer space and it crashes on Earth. No, these are traditional wolfman, wolf's bane, pentagram on the hand kind of werewolves, but in the future on a spacecraft. In a way, and it would be kind of interesting if this happened, you could totally see J.J. Abrams making this into a movie. I would love to see J.J. Abrams option Wolf Moon, although it'll probably need a different title. But I would love to see him option Wolf Moon and make it into a movie. I mean, good God, it can't be worse than the Cloverfield Paradox. Jesus, it can't be worse than that. But that's what David Irons has done. These 5 books, and he's had a couple of short stories, and you can always find all of his short films, and his movie never got released, but as a critic, I had a screener of his film, Cassette, which was then renamed to Identity Crisis, but then the production company that was going to release it, or the distribution company, went out of business, so the film technically never came out. But there are copies out there. It's been leaked to the internet, so you can see his movie Cassette, although I don't remember which title got leaked out. I don't remember if it's called Identity Crisis or Cassette on the leaked version. So that you'll have to actually look for, but his name is David Irons, and he's made a bunch of great music videos for the band Roxy Drive. He's got these paperbacks out, which I think they're all available on Amazon. Don't quote me on that. But I really recommend this. I recommend David Irons. I recommend Nightwaves, Polybius, Night Creepers, Graveyard Billy, and Wolf Moon. If you're into that 80s style horror throwback sort of novel. And this is not an Ernest Cline piece of crap where everything is, and then I put the Ghostbusters sticker on my DeLorean and then revved up the flux capacitor, and then I threw Rush on the cassette player, and then we were going to go play Adventure on the Atari. All Ernest Cline's book is reference. That's not what David Irons is going for. This is not just full of 80s references. This is an 80s style of book writing. And that's the big difference between garbage like Ernie Cline and someone like David Irons. David Irons actually respects his audience, whereas Ernie Cline looks down at you. But that said, if you're into the 80s stuff, if you're into the throwback stuff, you really should check out David Irons and his work. And again, that is Nightwaves, Polybius, Night Creepers, Graveyard Billy, and Wolf Moon. And I recommend reading him in that order because you can kind of see him grow as an author as you kind of read these in the order that they were written. You know, like Nightwaves, you can still see he's finding his feet a little bit. Polybius is better, and then Night Creepers, and you can see each one getting better and better, even if the plots are sort of ridiculous, like a werewolves in outer space, or Graveyard Billy. It's like a cat is able to communicate with a ghost and they're trying to stop a supernatural serial killer. If you say that out loud, it sounds kind of ridiculous. But you tell me that you aren't somewhat intrigued by that you don't say to yourself, you know what, that actually sounds kind of interesting. And that's what David Irons, I think he's tapping into a market here. And that's what I really like about his work, is he's tapping into, maybe it's my nostalgia glasses, but he's tapping into my nostalgia, not of the 80s, but of the trashy horror and sci-fi paperbacks I read in the 80s. I read all of this kind of stuff when it was new. So there's a big difference there when it comes to that sort of thing, where this just, I don't know, it hits me just right. Whereas something like Ready Player One, I thought was not only talking down to me, but was so dumb, I felt insulted for having read the damn thing. So look up David Irons. Look up these books. You might be maybe you'll be disappointed. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe I'm reading the room wrong. But I don't think you're going to be disappointed. I think, if nothing else, buy a copy of Graveyard Billy just because it helps cats. That it goes to an animal shelter, and David doesn't make a cent off Graveyard Billy. Whether you like the story or not, it's going to a good cause. But then I also think Wolf Moon was some of the most fun I've had reading a book in a long time. And that really does say something. So after this, we'll deal with our final segment, where in the last couple of episodes, I gave you 10 TV series that you might not remember. And now I'm not going to do that this week. I'm going to talk about 5 anthology series that you may or may not remember, because I want to spend a little bit more time on these. When there's 10 of them, there's not enough time to really go into it. It's basically just name drop, name drop, name drop, name drop. Here, go find it yourself. So I'm going to do 5, and I specifically made them all anthology shows because I don't know. There's just something about an anthology sci-fi show that always hits me just right. So after the break, we'll look at 5 of these that maybe you remember, maybe you don't.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
I don't know about you guys, but I've just always had a thing for the anthology series format. Because there's just this thing where, okay, like on Star Trek The Next Generation, or you're watching Farscape, or you're watching Firefly or whatever, whether it's a serialized story or it's very episodic bottle show kind of thing, you're just going from week to adventure, and you're following the same characters. But what if you don't like those characters? Or what if you're just not into the current plot line? You can really lose your way there. With an anthology series, it's a kind of a double-edged sword, because every week you have a new adventure. You have new sets of characters. If you don't like those characters, well, you can just find new characters next week. Maybe you'll like the story next week better. But then on the other hand, it's a double-edged sword, because what if you're really, really liking this week's story and it's only 45 minutes long or 22 minutes long, and it's like, oh man, I would like to see more with that. So the anthology format, it's very difficult sometimes to get into an anthology because of the fact that you kind of never know what you're getting from week to week. And that also, in a way, makes anthologies more expensive to make, because as large as the budget on Star Trek The Next Generation may be, every week you're using the same sets, the same costumes, the same props, you've got the same extras, etc. That cuts down on long-term costs. Up front, that's going to be more expensive, but you're going to cut down on long-term costs. When you're dealing with an anthology, every week you've got different costumes, different extras, different actors, different sets, different props. That can get very expensive and get cost prohibitive at times. So an anthology series, like I said, it's a double-edged sword. It can hurt you or it can help you, one way or the other. So I'm going to look at 5 anthology series from the 80s, 90s, and one that's from the 2000s maybe you forgot about. First, let's start with arguably the largest one here, Amazing Stories, the Steven Spielberg helmed anthology series from 1985 to 1987. And it recently had a reboot on iTunes that was just horrendous. I went into it with open eyes. I said, all right, hit me. Or to quote from Night of the Demons again, thrill me. And it did not. It was almost as bad as Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone. But that's for a different episode. But Amazing Stories was a real game changer at the time it came out. When Amazing Stories came out, Spielberg was at the top of the world. He got his start in TV and Night Gallery and Name of the Game, stuff like that. So him returning to TV at this point in 1985 was a giant deal. And the thing was, NBC was so behind this show, they picked it up for a guaranteed 44-episode, 2-season run. And that was a mistake, because there are some really good Amazing Stories episodes. I'm not going to say that there's not. But the ratings were not there. I've heard that even before season 1 was finished, NBC wanted out of this. But they had a guaranteed contract, so Spielberg got to keep making Amazing Stories episodes. And a lot of people pointed out at the time, these were not so amazing episodes. And one of the problems with that was they had so much money and no great scripts. They had some great ideas that didn't turn out to be great scripts. Joe Dante once told me when I interviewed him, because he worked on both the 1985 Twilight Zone and Amazing Stories, and he said the shows could not have been more different from one another. On Amazing Stories, you had all the money in the world and no ideas to use that money. On Twilight Zone, you had amazing ideas and you had no money. So it was sort of a give and take. But Amazing Stories was 44 anthology episodes with Spielberg behind this, and he directed a bunch of them. They all looked great. They had massive budgets for the time. They looked fantastic. He got huge stars. He got a lot of stars, strangely enough, to direct episodes like Tom Hanks and stuff like that. And he got big names like Joe Dante and Martin Scorsese to direct episodes. And it was really interesting. At the same time, most stories don't work. For one thing, the series had a huge tonal issue. You never knew from week to week whether you were going to get a lighthearted children's style story, like maybe a Goonies style story, or if you were going to get a mean-spirited gremlin sort of story about little monsters and being scared. So it was sort of a crapshoot in that regard, that you never really knew what you were getting. And with an anthology series, and this will come up in another episode, you need to have some sort of a tonal consistency. Not where everyone's going to be like, okay, here we go again this week, but just you kind of need to know what you're going to get into. And Amazing Stories was not the most amazing, but it was an interesting experiment. And if nothing else, my God, do these things look great. And when you compare them to the contemporaries of The Twilight Zone, which I think was the better series, or something like the new Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Amazing Stories beats them all hands down on terms of a visual and production design level. But then you had something like, at the same time, on HBO at first, Ray Bradbury Theater. Now this was not HBO's first foray into original programming. They had had a few things a couple of years earlier, but this was one of their first. And Ray Bradbury Theater was obviously Ray Bradbury stories. And if you know Ray Bradbury's work, well, then you know exactly what you're going to get. Bradbury wrote every episode of all 65 episodes, and he didn't direct any of them, but he wrote them all. Most were based on short stories of his from his books and anthologies, but he wrote a couple original stories for Ray Bradbury Theater. So there's a few originals in there. Now this is almost the exact opposite of Amazing Stories in the terms of, the HBO episodes, the first two seasons, did have larger budgets. But then after HBO dropped it, the USA Network picked up the show and made a couple of more seasons, and that didn't work out as well. The USA episodes were shot in Europe, and they had a lot smaller budgets. And the budget was always the problem. Bradbury would think outside of the budget. These stories were so much bigger than what a little syndicated series could actually produce. So in a lot of cases, you had great stories held up by under Doctor Who level special effects and sets. And if you can get past the goofy sets and the bad special effects, there's some really damn good stories in Ray Bradbury Theater. Every episode is narrated by him and is opened by him. The HBO episodes had him in like a little vignette at the beginning of each one. And you had some great names in these, like Michael Ironside, William Shatner, Drew Barrymore. I could just go on and on. Ray Bradbury Theater was a fantastic show if you can get past the less than high production values that it had. Then we had Spicy City. This was another HBO one, but this was animated. This was by Ralph Bakshi, a guy who did not do TV often. I mean, yes, I know he started, with the Terry Toon stuff and 60s Spider-Man, and then there was the whole kerfuffle over the 80s Mighty Mouse, but you didn't see him doing TV much in this era. He was a movie guy. And so HBO basically gave him 6 half hours and was called Spicy City, and I might be selling the show a little bit short, but it was kind of like heavy metal as an animated series. These were very adult, very sexual. I don't think they would qualify for an R, but these were very hard PG-13, very sexual. They had Ralph Bakshi's style all over them. And Spicy City, it's sort of a divisive thing in the halls of HBO because they liked it, but they hated it. They hated the writing, and when Spicy City came up for renewal, they said they would only renew it if he hired Hollywood writers instead of the weirdos that hung out at the head shop that wrote all of season 1, and he's like, I'm not doing it then. So Spicy City, just 6 half-hour episodes. They're fantastic. And then you had Sci-Fi Channel trying to get in on this. They had an interesting idea. Again, I don't know if it was the budgets or just bad writing, but they had Welcome to Paradox. And the idea was this was the city of Paradox, and while it was an anthology series with no recurring characters, they would all take place in the same city. Which they didn't really deal with too often, because none of the episodes referenced the events of other episodes, so it was kind of interchangeable. But they had like Henry Rollins starring in an episode, they had Ice-T in an episode. It lasted one 13-episode season. Welcome to Paradox was interesting. That's the way I'll put it. Is it good? No, not really. Is it interesting? Yes. Yes, it is. And then finally, I mentioned how Spicy City was sort of heavy metal, the animated series, but they actually had a heavy metal series. It was live action, kind of. It was called the Metal Hurlant Chronicles. For those that don't know, Heavy Metal Magazine started as a French magazine called Metal Hurlant, which literally translates to either screaming metal or heavy metal when you translate the title. So Metal Hurlant Chronicles is owing more towards its original French origins than heavy metal, the American version, but at the same time, it's very much heavy metal, the series, and it would adapt various stories from heavy metal and Metal Hurlant, and again, this one, the budgets just were not there. It was shot in Europe, it was shot in France, the show's creator directed every episode for both seasons. And they did get some stars like Rutger Hauer, Michael Jai White, Michael Biehn, people like that. Everyone looks like they're slumming. These things look like most of the episodes were shot against a bad green screen that doesn't work. The special effects, this came out in 2012 when it was shot. They look like early 2000s, late 90s CGI. Again, this was just one. They work because there are some good stories being told. I mean, hell, 2 of the stories are written by Alejandro Jodorowsky from stories he wrote for Metal Hurlant back in the day. But at the same time, my God, these don't work. They look awful. I'm one of those guys where I am somewhat able to overlook bad special effects if there's a good story being told. Metal Hurlant Chronicles really pushed my boundaries on that. These look as bad as you think that they do. I've seen YouTube videos that have better production values than this supposedly professional TV series had, unless they wasted all their money just getting the stars over to Europe. I mean, this is such a slapdash French-Belgian anthology series. They even misspell the names. Like Michael Jai White is in 2 episodes, and his name is misspelled in the credits in one of them. That's how slapdash this was. So while it is an official heavy metal product, a heavy metal Hurlant anthology series, it's worth checking out, but you're going to be disappointed on this one. I didn't always say I would talk to you about a TV series you would like, but Metal Hurlant Chronicles at least is worth a view. So that's 5 anthology series, and there are way more. There were so many anthology shows in the 80s and 90s. There's way more I can talk about in another episode. But that's it for the Sci-Fi podcast here on the GSMC network. So I want to thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast, brought to you, of course, by the GSMC podcast network. I also want you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review underneath this, because it really does help. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm Josh Hadley. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.